Hi, everyone. As always, I hope that this video finds each of you well and your family well. This video is going to be dedicated strictly to conducting a case study analysis. Each of you were sent a practice case study analysis, which is roughly 4 pages long. And then you also received a document that's called case studies. There will be 3 case studies in there. The first one called Making Connections, which will be the one that you'll do for a grade. And then skip the second one. And then the third one is called The Little Engine That Couldn't. That one will be strictly for extra credit. So the one you'll be doing for an assignment or for a grade is going to be called Making Connections. And today we're going to work through the example called it's Practice Case Study. And that's how it's titled in the document I sent you. And doing case study analysis is a useful tool for pre-service teachers or teachers when they're trying to kind of understand what are the problems that can arise in a classroom, authentic problems, and then how would we go about addressing those problems from a theoretical standpoint, trying to come up with solutions that would work for most of the students. So it's a useful tool for teachers to kind of go back and forth on different approaches to understanding a problem and developing a rationale and solution for that. So when you read that first case study analysis, what I'd recommend that you do before going too far along in this video is to read it. Like I said, roughly 4 pages. And what I find to be the most useful tool is that it's broken down. The worksheet that I sent you is kind of broken down into 4 different areas. First is identifying problems. Second is connecting the problems to a theory or a principle of learning. Then making a connection, describing that connection, and then developing a set of solutions based on the theory or principle of learning that you identified. And so what I find to be very helpful is when teachers, students, is after reading a case study to really lay out all of the problems that they identify within a case study. You could have as many as 5, 6, 7 problems, and you're going to find very quickly that some of those problems are just outside of the scope of teachers. Maybe they have to deal with administrative, state issues, resources that are unavailable to you, parenting things that you can't control. And I say that because I want to get all of the problems laid out first so that we can, as teachers or as practitioners, and develop a rationale and say, you know what, this is something that I think we can address together. And you'll realize some are pretty easy, and then some would be very difficult. I'm always I err on the side of, hey, pick the ones that you know you can knock off the list pretty quickly. If you can solve this problem and it doesn't require a lot of resources or a lot of time, that's the first one I'm going to do. Okay, so focus on what you can control and the things that you can fix, and some of those bigger ones you might have to leave off your to-do list for a while. So, looking at that first case study, okay, you have read it. I assume that you will have read it before going through this exercise. The first thing is we got to lay out the problems. And I've already listed a number of problems that you may have identified yourself, and you might have some other ones that you think are equally as important. But I laid out a series of problems. First one that I've identified is the idea of ability groups. That when Celeste comes into the school, the teachers have already established groups. Typically, the groups are the low, middle, and high achievers, right? They've even gone so far as to designate by use of stickers, by names, and you'll see that some of the names are silly, right? They have the eagles for the high flyers, and the sparrows for the middle, and then they have crows for the low. I mean, it's just like I think it's a little bit over the top, but it is what it is. So anyway, we take a look at that, and you'll realize that one of the problems is this idea of ability grouping, putting kids into groups based on that, and then identifying or putting labels on that. All right. Secondly, is the teachers gossiping. You take a look at a couple of the older teachers talking about the Blaine family and about Eddie Blaine and what he might be like, and what happened to the Blaine family and all of that stuff. And we see that as a big problem because, one, you're prejudging a student before you even had them in the classroom. Another problem was the kids fighting. We saw the kids fighting out on the playground, and what were they fighting? Why were they fighting? Okay, we saw that through the case study. They identified that the high achievers were getting in arguments and fights with low achieving groups. They're name calling, okay, calling them dummies. The other people calling them nerds. I mean, it's based on, again, labeling, ability grouping, and that was, in some respects, how the fights broke down along those lines. Fourth is another problem I identified was the parental involvement. Now, we don't have a lot in the video there or in the case study that addresses parent involvement, except that Eddie Blaine's mother, Celeste, reaches out to talk to her, try to figure out what we can do, et cetera, et cetera. She has nothing to do with it. She wants nothing to do with it. She's disinterested in his progress at school, his problems at school. Hangs up. She tries to call back, gets a busy signal. She can't even get a hold of her, right? So that's a potential problem. Another potential problem I saw was low teacher self-efficacy. I remember self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to complete a task. Well, Celeste clearly identified that she had to reach out to a professor of hers to talk about whether or not, what strategy she might employ. What could she do, right? So she was very uncomfortable with her decision making and couldn't even stand up for herself to some extent with the veteran teachers. Where does that come from? Lack of experience, a lack of belief in yourself, in your ability, or your self-efficacy. So low teacher self-efficacy. And then lastly is you could identify a potential problem as being the closed-mindedness of the veteran teachers. They were not open to change. They didn't seem to be open to suggestion of changing things up and how they group their students. They were pretty much set in their ways. That's how they've been doing it all these years. And anything that Celeste would bring up was probably not going to be well received. So you may have identified other problems. That's great. But I like to start with just putting down on a piece of paper all the different problems that I can identify. That way, when I go to the next part of that case study worksheet, then I can be more selective about the things that I think I can actually address. So, first part of the worksheet, when you look at it, is you'll see it says identify a problem or 3 problems, and you put them up. I've given you 6 here, all right, for the practice case study. Now, after you've identified a potential problem, the second question it asks is, what theory or principle of learning would you connect to it? So let's take a look at one of these, okay? Let's take a look at the ability groups, okay, or the idea of labeling, all right? What theory or principle of learning might that be connected to? Okay, how could we, remember, theories explain why. So why is this a problem? Well, first we have to identify the different theories or principles of learning that we've addressed. Now remember, this case study is primarily focused on the cognition unit, on applying learning principles, not developmental, not social-emotional, any of that other stuff, not necessarily even motivational stuff. We're focusing on the cognition, the learning principles, the learning theories. So what have we talked about thus far? All right, I hope you can kind of read this. But what I have up here as far as cognitive theories, all right, who have we talked about? We talked about Piaget, all right. What did Piaget talk about? He talked about assimilation. I abbreviated some of these things for space-saving reasons. But he talked about learning through assimilation and accommodation, right? He also talked about the importance of creating disequilibrium, or how learning takes place through accommodation. Therefore, in order to get that change, we've kind of got to force them or create an opportunity for some sort of disequilibrium, right? We also talked about Vygotsky and Vygotsky's use of scaffolding. How do we get students from their independent level to where we want them to be, right? So we talked about scaffolding. We also talked about operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, we talked about the use of reinforcement or punishment to shape or change behavior. Now remember, Skinner talked about that optimally using reinforcement is much better because it communicates your expectations. The students understand what is expected of them, and they get something for it that they enjoy. Whereas in punishment is decreasing a behavior, can be used, will be used, but to change or shape behavior, we're much more inclined to use reinforcement. We also talked about social cognitive theory, SCT, OC's opera conditioning. SCT is social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory is Bandura's work. We talk about the use of models and observational learning, learning through models and what makes it for an effective model. We talked about self-efficacy there. Again, the idea that your belief in your ability to complete a task, and students with low self-efficacy versus high self-efficacy. We also talked about self-regulation, students' ability to identify an objective, a goal, and figure out how do they achieve it. We also talked about information processing theory and the role of attention in information processing theory, how important it is. And we talked about the model of information processing theory. One of the things that's really important is working memory capacity, or where you hold on to information. You can only hold on to so much information at a time. And therefore, as a teacher, we have to be mindful about how much we give our students at any given time if we want them to be able to process that information effectively. And we talked about getting that stuff to their long-term memory. And getting stuff to long-term memory is we talk about strategies, rehearsal, meaningful learning, elaboration, how important elaboration is to getting that stuff. And then we talked about metacognition, students thinking about thinking, and how when kids are really young, they really don't understand or don't have very strong metacognitive activity, whereas students that get into junior high and high school become much more aware of their ability to problem solve or think in their metacognitive activity. And lastly, we talked about, well, not lastly, we talked about this with Wong, the Wong video, and some of the discussion there. Okay, and we talked about the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that students see themselves a certain way, and if it's reinforced by other people, the teachers, the parents, stuff like that, pretty soon they start to believe that's who they are, that's what they're capable of, that's what they're going to do, and therefore, self-fulfilling prophecy is going to lead them to becoming that person that they already believe them to be. So these are the things that we primarily talked about in the cognitive unit as it relates to around theories of learning, principles of learning, etc. And I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll pick up with another one, which will be then taking this information and then putting it to use, okay? But I wanted to make sure that we had a good outline of the theories and principles of learning that we've already discussed.